Welcome back to yet another review for the X-Men franchise. Now today's going to be slightly different because I want to tackle two movies in this review for you. You see, this is the last two movies that kind of had like the ensemble kind of cast from people that we definitely know of, and this is the completely new timeline that they had made after Days of Future Past was created, so I'd figured let's just put these two together to kind of wrap this little part of the franchise up in a bow. Now, the film that came after Days of Future Past was Deadpool, so we're going in a little bit of a different order here, but the first film that was made after Days of Future Past for the X-Men moniker was X-Men Apocalypse. X-Men Apocalypse takes place in the 80s, many years later after the events of Days of Future Past. We see the group come together once again as they fight an ancient being known as Apocalypse, once an ancient ruler who also had mutant powers, who has now come back after many years to reclaim what was his. As stated before, this was coming off the high of not only Days of Future Past, but actually a little bit of Deadpool. So, was this the film to finally put the X-Men on the map and really give it the boost that it needed again? No, not in the slightest. You see, I had a love-hate relationship with this movie for a little bit because when I first saw it, I really liked it when I was like younger, and then I went back and I rewatched it and I was like, oh boy, this does not hold up whatsoever. And the most unfortunate part about it too is it's directed by Bryan Singer. Yeah, you heard me. Bryan Singer directed this, the guy who made the first X-Men movie, the second X-Men movie, and Days of Future Past. Arguably, close to the, definitely for Days of Future Past, a top 3 X-Men movie. X2 definitely up there as well. He's made some of the best X-Men movies as far as like the full cast goes in this entire franchise. And yet, here he is making arguably one of the worst ones that they had ever made. So we're going to jump a little bit around here for this review since I want to cram as much as I can in these two videos talking about both of the last films of the X-Men era for Fox. So let's just get into it. So the beginning of the film starts in 3600 BC. We see ancient Egypt. We see a bunch of rulers for it. We see that there is a man who is Apocalypse in this scenario, who is basically transferring his consciousness to other people so that he can live on for generations afterwards. But the regular civilians have had enough, and they devise a plan to trap them in there and kill all these mutants by locking them in and basically cracking the entire pyramid and having it collapse from the inside. Now, the setup for it is a little bit intriguing, and you see a lot of really cool deaths here. We've talked about the violence in these movies before and how much better they are, I think, in these movies compared to probably like some of the Marvel properties that we see. We see a guy kind of get like folded up and scrunched up into a box a little bit. We see some gnarly deaths from people dying from the debris falling from the top of the ceiling. And Apocalypse ends up living because he's still in the state of unconsciousness because the powers did not fully transfer through, but he is saved by one of the other people who gives their life basically by making sure there's a force field around him to keep him safe from all the debris. This then jumps forward up into the 80s, so it's past the events of Days of Future Past. For these characters, we are now in this timeline of this film, and we first see Scott Summers. Scott Summers is in high school in this movie, played by Ty Sheridan, and I gotta say, this is not the move. This is definitely not the move whatsoever. Sorry. So, as we've discussed before many times, the X-Men films have gotten a lot of things wrong, unfortunately, and one of those is definitely Scott Summers. So there is a lot to criticize X-Men for, and this is definitely one of them. The treatment for Cyclops in these films has not been that great over the years. And this is just further proof of it because I do not appreciate this portrayal of him whatsoever. He kind of comes off as like a snarky little brat in these scenes, like throughout the entire movie. I never really bought him as the character because here's the thing with Cyclops. You're supposed to believe that he is like, outside of Charles Xavier, the on-field kind of leader of the X-Men here. Now, granted, in the ways that it's been presented in these sort of films after Jennifer Lawrence was brought in, she was kind of shown as like the de facto leader in this, which we'll get to later. But for a guy that's supposed to be the face of this group, basically, at least like on battle, he doesn't bring it whatsoever. Like, I don't know, part of that is the characterization of him, how he's written. Part of that is just, I think, the performance in general. I just never really believed him as Cyclops. And I think it's an unfortunate way to start for him because he's still in high school in this movie. James Marden is like a grown-ass man in these movies. Like, all of these guys are grown in these movies in the earlier films, so it's easier to see how much of an established group that everybody is, and he's way more intimidating in that than in this. But we basically see a scene with him in school where his powers end up kind of being triggered during like kind of a bullying sequence, which then leads to his brother Alex, who was in previous X-Men movies, taking him to the school where Charles is at. In the meantime, this is where we get to see other characters in this movie, and this is where the continuity ends up getting even more messed up than normal. We see Mystique going around, and her mission is to kind of basically free mutants from any sort of harm, basically. We see this version of Angel, not the same version that we see in X-Men The Last End, which would come many years later, actually. We see him have a battle with this version of Nightcrawler, and not a fan of either one of them here. I, again, just don't like the portrayal of these guys. I kind of like the idea of like these mutants almost being like caged animals. It's almost like dog fights, you know, I could reference to, where like you capture them and then you just make them fight against each other to the death. So that part of it I think is kind of interesting. I just don't appreciate how many different times we're going to see characters and how different everyone's going to look years before the first one in the timeline order would have actually appeared. But my biggest concern here is with the one and only Jennifer Lawrence. I've been stating in the past that I am not a big fan of Jennifer Lawrence, but I've also said that I like her performance in Days of Future Past. I think her character is written very well. I think she's integrated into the story extremely well. I just think overall she's a good addition in the Days of Future Past storyline. However, it is not the same when it comes to X-Men Apocalypse and later on. You could definitely tell that she just does not want to be this character anymore. She is way less into the makeup for Raven. She is definitely not in it as much as one would want her to be. She just kind of is playing Jennifer Lawrence in this movie. Like, there's not a ton of scenes here that I was just like, oh cool, she's playing Raven, yay. A lot of times I was annoyed that she's just playing herself, basically. You then move on to the next negative I have in this movie, which is Magneto. Eric is living in Poland now with a new family. He has a wife and a daughter, and he lives there as a clean man, basically. His story changes drastically throughout the movie, and we'll kind of touch on it as we go along with this. We see the plot kind of instigate a little bit more, where we see Moira McTaggart in Egypt, kind of investigating some of this ancient Egypt stuff, the religion that used to praise what Apocalypse was, and eventually she leaves a little bit of sunlight out, and it allows the machine to fully complete the transformation for the man, and now he is back alive. If you look at this character himself, you would not realize probably that it is Oscar Isaac behind all of this, which is unfortunate because he is a really good actor, but this role is just not that good, honestly. Characterization's kind of bland. The voice for it, I'm just not the biggest fan of, and just the design of him himself is kind of lackluster. Once Apocalypse is walking around, we get introduced to a couple of the characters and revisit a few of them from earlier in the story. We see this version of Storm, and Apocalypse ends up taking her and upgrading her powers, so now she has the white hair, and she's becoming an all-powerful mutant in this sense. He goes and finds Psylocke and upgrades her powers, which then leads to them finding Angel, upgrading his powers, and then we get all the way to Magneto here. So Magneto's arc is kind of annoying because we see that Apocalypse is kind of doing all he can to kind of change, you know, the course of history now. And in doing so, there's an accident at the steel mill that Eric is working at, and he basically saves a man, but because of this, some people see him and report it to the police. Now, the scene here is good in like an isolated incident. Like, I really like the emotion between the mother and the daughter and Magneto himself, just kind of like, you know, please don't hurt anybody, I'll go with you, I'm just trying to be like a normal guy, like can't we all just get along sort of deal. But then due to the daughter kind of freaking out and her powers going haywire, it ends up getting her and the wife killed, which then prompts Magneto to use his child's necklace to basically murder everybody by having the necklace go through each of the police's throats. Again, a very isolated scene here. I would like it a lot. But in the grand scheme of the X-Men universe, it becomes laughable. Because now, he's just back to being bad. At first he was good, then he was bad, then he was put away, then he's like, okay, we'll do some good, and then we'll be bad again. He flips his decisions constantly. It's very, very annoying. Leading up until the scene where Apocalypse meets Magneto at the steel mill, and they basically are able to make this new form of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. During this portion of the movie, Charles is trying to find Magneto so that they could save him before he ends up being captured by Apocalypse, but this is null and void because at this point Apocalypse knows where headquarters he's at. He realizes that Charles has a power that he's never possessed, so now he wants to fuse his consciousness into him. They end up meeting Charles and all the X-Men at the mansion to where they're about to steal him, but this prompts one of the better scenes in this entire movie and honestly the franchise. The scene is started by Alex shooting the jet while trying to save Charles and everybody from Apocalypse, but in doing so, the jet explodes and now Quicksilver has to save everybody in the mansion. This scene I think is way better than the one in Days of Future Past because I like the soundtrack a little bit more for this one, honestly, even though it is way overplayed during the era of the TikTok trend where they had the song and like the movements of him, you know, being similar to the movie. It's a little overplayed now, but I definitely do enjoy it still watching it back though. I also love it because we also get to see a little bit more humor out of him in this scene. We already know that he's kind of a funny guy, so this is kind of a way for him to kind of do a little bit more goofball stuff to kind of like get his character over a little bit more. He makes like kissy faces at somebody, and then he like saves like a fish and then saves a dog, and like he makes weird faces at people and like has to drink and eat food like as he's running around because he needs to keep up his energy. It's a great scene. There's really not much to say about it other than like you just need to watch it to appreciate it for yourself, really. But what's unfortunate here is that there was a little bit of a missed opportunity before this scene happened. We see Scott, Jean, Nightcrawler, and Jubilee, actually, who's not in any of the movies outside of this one. They come back from the mall, and what's unfortunate is that you could have had a really cool 80s style scene with them running around in the mall, exploring the city a little bit more, and really developing their characters more, because that's my biggest issue with these last few movies, is I don't care about any of these characters. And if I would have had a scene where watching them kind of explore the real world with each other, it would have been a lot better. But no, we cut to a scene with them saying, you know, the third movie is always the worst in the trilogy about Star Wars, and then they just come back and then they're like, oh cool, the mansion has exploded now. Just a really bad approach to the characterization. I really wish they would have added something here because it probably would have made me care a little bit more for everybody. This then leads to, however, William Stryker being brought back into the story, and there's honestly way too much going on in this movie at this point. You have the X-Men Apocalypse stuff here. You have Magneto's turmoil that he's basically having throughout his entire life. You have William Stryker coming back in this story, and not to mention they're planting seeds for the Dark Phoenix storyline in this movie. And while I appreciate the idea of planting the seeds for it, but this movie is already jumbled with a lot of stuff going on at this point. This then prompts another great scene in this movie, actually. We see that all the mutants are basically transported to Alkali Lake, but Nightcrawler, Jean, and Scott are there to try to save the day, and in doing so, they end up finding Logan. We get to see him kind of walk out of this like caged enclosure, and we see him in the full-on Weapon X sort of gear. He has the helmet on, he has a bunch of wires coming out of his body because of all the test subjects that he's obviously probably ran during this time. It's just a great scene. Like, we see him tear ass through all of these hallways. You see so much blood being splattered everywhere, far more than I would have expected, honestly. But it's just a great, great scene. I will say the only damper on this is that there's a little bit of a weird moment towards the end of it with him and Jean Grey, and it's Sophie Turner's version of Jean Grey, and she's like really young in this, so it's kind of an odd thing to think about when you jump 20 years later to like the actual X-Men timeline. But regardless, I love it nonetheless, and we get back on the track to finding a way to stop Apocalypse. Now, there's some decent parts in these fights that I will give this movie. They make Storm try to be a little bit more of a badass. Psylocke has some cool moments here, but then you also get some shitty moments because you see Angel be completely useless at this point. There is actually a nice concept here at one point during this movie where Charles and Apocalypse's mind get connected because they start the process of transferring over his consciousness, but it's kind of broken up in between. So there's almost a decent battle within the minds of the two of them, and I like some of it, but then he obviously has to say really terrible dialogue here.
Welcome to my world. You're at my house now.
Just why? Why is that they have to say that? Like, why? You couldn't have thought of anything else really there. But this is where you get every character kind of trying to change philosophy at this point, because the only way to stop Apocalypse is everyone kind of to gang up on him. So you see Storm gang up on Apocalypse because he's trying to kill Raven, and it was referenced earlier in the movie that Storm loves Raven because she's kind of this figure for mutants ever since the assassination attempt that almost happened in Days of Future Past. We see Scott shooting beams at him and trying to slow him down to connect to Charles Xavier. But the one thing that makes me even more mad than anything is we see Magneto change his heart yet again in this movie, and he makes the big X in front of the building that Charles is in, and he's like, no, I betrayed them. And it's like, you chose this time to change. Why? Just because Raven had something to say to you? Like, it's such a bad characterization for him. Like, he changes so much, and it just gets worse and worse for him after this. But I will say they at least do try to give Jean Grey a little bit of something in this movie. They try at least for somebody that's on the younger side of the X-Men group. We see Jean help kill Apocalypse, and we see a shadow of a Phoenix power, thus hinting at what the next movie was going to be. Again, wrapping things up on Apocalypse, it's a very disappointing movie, especially coming off of the last two films that came before that one, especially with a director like Bryan Singer. Like, this was his vision afterwards for Days of Future Past. This is what he wanted to do. He gives poor characterization for the new characters. Old characters are really bad in it too. This is the first time that we get a hint of Jennifer Lawrence not wanting to do these movies anymore. And it shows. Dialogue is pretty crap all around. There's so many zoom-in shots of them saying corny-ass lines. There's a couple of cool moments here with the Quicksilver scene and the Wolverine cameo, and it's the last Wolverine cameo that you're gonna get outside of his last movie in Logan up until this point. All in all, a very, very disappointing movie off of the heels of two of the better ones that had been made in years. I'm gonna give X-Men Apocalypse 2 stars. Also, a little bit of apologies here, I will say. I'm filming this as there's a pretty decent rainstorm, and I'm right next to part of the house that has a metal roof. So if you hear all that happening, you know, it's just the anger taking over watching this. But if you thought that X-Men Apocalypse was the worst it could get, trust me, it gets so much worse. X-Men Dark Phoenix was directed by Simon Kinberg, who was actually a longtime writer and producer for the X-Men franchise. And this is his directorial debut. A big budget, multi-million-dollar action stunt fest. Who thought that was a good idea? Who thought this was a good idea? So X-Men Dark Phoenix is supposed to be the Dark Phoenix storyline yet again. They figured, well, we failed the first time. Surely we can do it better the second time, right? And they don't. It is quite honestly an embarrassment compared to the first one. I'm getting ahead of myself. I should probably tell you a little bit of why this movie is dog shit. Beginning of the movie shows Jean as a kid in a car accident with her parents that ends up killing her mother. This then leads Charles visiting her into the hospital at this point and bringing her into the school. This is just a way for them to kind of build their relationship a little bit because it's going to start to get withered throughout the entire story here. So we jump from the 70s in that portion of the story back now to the 90s in this story. Now, once again, we get a little bit more continuity issues here because this is 1992. First movie came out in 2000. James McAvoy is now supposed to look like Patrick Stewart in about 10 years. Which isn't the most unreasonable thing in the world, I would say personally. The more offensive one is Michael Fassbender's supposed to look like Ian McKellen in roughly 10 years here. That's the one that's really embarrassing. I see a lot of people talking about like, oh, he's supposed to look like Patrick Stewart, you know, in 10 years or whatever. No, look at the other guy. The other guy looks way worse in 10 years. He must have done a lot of fucking drugs at that point, because holy shit, in the 8 years that it's supposed to be in the next film, he turns drastically different. But regardless, before we kill ourselves over the entire continuity issues that these last two movies have started to talk about, but not only is it annoying that we have to think of the giant leap that it takes for what these actors are supposed to look like in about 10 years in this storyline, the bigger issue I have here is the idea that the X-Men are now spacemen. This whole time, they have not done anything in space. Nothing whatsoever. And eventually stuff in the comics ends up coming to that, obviously. But to introduce it in, like, the last movie of the Fox era, because this movie was made and Disney bought it not too long after, so this was the last of the Fox era. And oh, it's an interesting choice to go towards, I'll give you that. So as the X-Men are asked to save a crew of astronauts, we see some cosmic energy be absorbed by Jean Grey up in space, to which everyone is perplexed by this. Throughout the entire movie, Sophie Turner tries her hardest to be a really good actress, and unfortunately the dialogue for her just doesn't really help her, because more than half of the dialogue that she has for the rest of this movie is a lot of, there's something that's inside of me that I can't control, and when it happens, bad thing happens, and I can't control it, and I'm afraid to hurt people, and I might just, want to stop watching the movie right now. Not to mention, this movie gets really cringe at this point too, because we end up seeing Jennifer Lawrence yet again in this film, and the makeup looks even worse than it did before. It's the worst it's looked yet, and she has to drop this bombshell of a line right here.
And by the way, the women are always saving the men around here. You might want to think about changing the name to X-Women.
Guys, we're 20 to 30 minutes in this movie, and I already hate it. And I already hate it so much. So if you thought that was bad, the next part gets even worse in this movie. The setup is already not great for the movie, and then on top of that, you get Jessica Chastain in this. Jessica Chastain's a good actress. She's actually really good. Why she signed on for this movie beats me. Because here's the thing. If the space stuff was already kind of like a big leap of faith to kind of take for this movie, to kind of be like, yeah, we're just going to start doing some space missions here, it's an even bigger leap for them to go, by the way, we're going to fight some aliens now. So yes, Jessica Chastain is now taken over by an alien. This is now the main villain for the rest of the movie outside of Jean Grey. We later find out that Charles is to blame for a lot of how Jean handles a lot of her powers, is because he decided at the young age after the accident had occurred to block all of the trauma in her memory of the events that had happened. Now, granted, the father was not being very supportive of her in that moment because she had gone through the car accident unscathed, but also Charles is kind of a dickhead in this movie for that. Why would you let that be the thing? Like, how is that helping her in any sense? So rather than Charles using one of his powers that is really in connection with people and helping people, he basically shoves her to the side and is like, that's a problem we'll deal with later. That is character assassination. That is not how Charles would help her. It's more realistic in X-Men The Last Stand when Charles is like, her power was so great and uncontrollable that in order for her to control it one day, I had to block a lot of it in her mind so that it wouldn't control her from out of nowhere at some point. That is more believable than a girl dealing with the traumatic issues of her parents dying in front of her. I'm not even going to cut any of that. I'm just over this movie at this point. We're halfway through and I'm over it at this point. If you thought Jennifer Lawrence really didn't want to get out of this movie as quick as she possibly could, obviously from the beginning of the movie, it's shown relatively quickly here, because at the 40-minute part of the movie, Jean has yet another episode with the powers kind of going out of control, which then promptly pushes her into one of the spikes at her father's house that she was at. So this is the end of Raven. She is no longer going to be in the X-Men timeline after this, and Jennifer Lawrence is just done as his character. So yet more continuity issues that happened. But this actually kind of sparks a bit of a positive in this movie. Nicolas Hoult has been kind of a solid player in these movies for the most part. Not my favorite iteration of Beast whatsoever, but he's a good actor at least. And it kind of shows a little bit here too, because after the events of Raven's funeral, he has a really intense conversation with Charles and blaming him for all the stuff that is about to be happening in this film. But what I can't get behind is that Beast now just kind of is just total 180 in philosophy. He's supposed to be a really smart guy, so for him just to go from not thinking rationally whatsoever just doesn't move me at all. It actually pisses me off, really. There's another small positive here too, where we see Jean try to ask help from Magneto at one point. He's now on an island with a bunch of mutants, basically trying to live alone and away from people. They have a little bit of an intense battle here where he's trying to save a bunch of shoulders, pushing away one of the helicopters while Jean is trying to pull it in and basically destroy it. This then makes her leave and have her run into Jessica Chastain's character, whose name is Vuk. She's part of an alien race that is trying to repopulate themselves, and in doing so, they need to take over another planet, and they chose Earth. And Jean and Charles cannot use their powers to telepathically get into their minds, unfortunately, so she's kind of persuaded by Jessica Chastain just by her telling her life story, basically. So at this point, the battle lines are kind of drawn between a lot of the characters here. We see Beast go off and find Magneto and tell Magneto what actually happened with Jean. So now, when Magneto is being a reserved man yet again, living away from people and not wanting to do bad things, he finds out that Jean had killed Raven, and now both him and Beast are bloodthirsty beings wanting to kill Jean Grey. I cannot tell you how much this stresses me out. Whatsoever. This then leads to a very funny line from Scott as him and Charles end up trying to find Jean Grey here.
Save it. If you touch her, I will fucking kill her.
This portion of the story is a pretty lame fight, to be honest with you, but once all the mutants are kind of captured and they're on a train, this is where the film kind of takes a slight turn. There was heavy reshoots for this film at the time, and they found out that a lot of the reshoots was revolving around this sequence during the movie, because it's a complete tone shift in this. A lot of the stuff in this movie is pretty boring up until this point. The actual train fight sequence, there's a lot of stuff to like here. Storm gets a little bit of action here, Beast has some more moments, and Nightcrawler actually gets to do some stuff. Even though I'm not the biggest fan of this version of Nightcrawler, I can admit that like the fight with him is alright. And then you get this really awesome shot of Magneto with all the guns being fired upon Jessica Chastain's character at one point. But the film is resolved by Jean Grey finally embracing the Phoenix powers and getting it under her own control. She takes Jessica Chastain and all these other aliens, vaporizes them, but in doing so she kills herself. So now, yet again, another little bit of a continuity error, because now we have Jean Grey being killed off in the 90s, and she's just not going to be in the rest of these movies, apparently. The resolution of this is we see Charles retire as the professor from the school. We see Beast take over as the leading professor of the entire school. Him and Magneto have a little bit of a chess match, and everyone just kind of goes on their merry way. This is such a whimper for the Fox era. I went into watching this movie hoping that it would be okay, hoping that they would be able to bring something out of this before they realize that it's now going off to Disney. They're going to get their own little stuff, but we're going to put our final stamp on this, and we're going to make sure that we're going to tell everybody that, yes, whatever they're going to do later, we did it first, and here's our little kind of neat bow on this. They did not do that. There is a couple of things that I liked in this movie. Very far and few in between. They get rid of Quicksilver so fast in this movie by throwing him in a pile of bushes. They threw away a character in the most unceremonious way possible. The acting in this cannot save this whatsoever. The direction of this movie is bland and tiresome. And again, it's because the guy didn't direct the movie before. And what's funny is he's helped write these movies, so I don't understand how a lot of the characterizations for these characters are just not fleshed out really well. This is another stain on this franchise that was once very promising and has a lot of great things in it, but for the Fox era, this was such a disappointment. I'm gonna give X-Men Dark Phoenix 1 star. Is genuinely one of the worst comic book movies ever made, to be quite honest with you. There is not a lot of redeeming qualities in this movie, and I really tried. There's some little things here and there that I like that are like kind of nitpicky sort of stuff, where it's like you see Charles use Cerebro, and you see him trying really hard to use Cerebro, and you see a little blood come out of his nose. Little things like that are nice, but like they're so far and few in between that it doesn't pile up to make a positive sort of impact. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you stuck around for this review. I know this was a little bit longer to have both of these movies kind of combined together, but I figured bringing these two films together to kind of end off this little timeline era of these movies was probably the necessary way to go. Look down below for all the socials. We're going to have a lot more things down there, especially for Letterboxd, my Twitter page where I talk about movies on there occasionally. And you also could see my TikTok page where I go a little in depth in some other things. Recently posted some stuff about some trailer news and some other opinions on some other movies that I had seen. Thank you guys so much for watching. Look forward to the next X-Men review coming very soon. And I will talk to you all next time.